This is Import Export with Lawrence Christoffelsz.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining Import Export here on Ticker TV. I'm your host, Lawrence Christoffelsz. Today's episode's all about some of the trade impacts and what might be occurring from different industry sectors. Now we're joined with Doris Li from How Communications to talk about the consumer sentiment over on the other side from China looking back towards Australia. So thanks so much for joining us, Doris.
Thank you for inviting me.
So before we kick off, Doris, tell us about How Communications. What's that company about and what's your role with that?
Sure. So How Communication basically is marketing communication agency in Australia, and it was founded by three marketing experts. So I'm one of those.
Great.
So my experience is within Australia and China. So helped quite a lot of Australian business to go into the China market, and I have been in the space for over 15 years now.
Fantastic. So I know that when companies in Australia, especially exporters from Australia going out to markets, every market's very different. China is a very specific market, and you need to make sure that your packaging, your branding, your communication strategy is packaged the right way. So I can see why that's so important with How Communications. What's your opinion of these recent trade tensions that have developed, and what's the consumer sentiment looking back from China as a consumer towards Australian business?
So I will be basically speaking from the consumer level.
Yeah.
So far, we actually haven't seen much sentiment from the consumers yet. Okay. If you go onto the Chinese social media and if you search Australia, there'll be some people talking about this, but it's not a lot. Okay. And we have this thing in China that is like a top 50 hot topics on social media every day. Yeah. I haven't seen Australia made into any yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bit of a relief, I think. A lot of exporters are quite worried and nervous about the sentiment towards Australian products over in China. So if it's not in the top 50, it's a positive. I know that, as Andrew mentioned previously as well, discretionary spending, luxury spending in China, just like every other part of the globe, has probably dropped off. So Australian products going to China, like your meat, like potentially the wine and so forth, which are quite pricey. Do you see that those products not selling as much anyway because of the COVID-19 lockdowns?
Well, there is some drop in the spending, of course, because some people lose their job.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were talking about revenge purchase after COVID-19, during the COVID-19 period. So people predict that there will be like a revenge buying afterwards. However, you see that happening to restaurant, food, and some mass products. However, with luxury products, because a lot of people losing their job or get cut on their income, there is some drop in there.
Right, okay. I wanted to ask about your emerging products. What other products have been on the rise between Australia and China?
Actually, the COVID-19 situation actually provides some opportunity to some products. I feel there's an opportunity for the Australian health products, especially Australia is famous for health products, because everyone now, there's no cure for COVID-19 yet, right? Yeah. So everyone's saying that you need to improve your immunity system. Yeah. So it's a good opportunity for the health products.
Yeah, that's a really strong point. Do you see that if the Chinese government, they've talked about education and tourism, we not discourage, but we may warn consumers about coming to Australia for tourism or sending their children for education, which are obviously big markets for us, big sectors with education and tourism. Do you see the Chinese population will take that heed advice?
I think it's more from the parents' perspective.
Right.
When they're sending the children to overseas to study, safety is one concern.
Okay.
And with this anti-China sentiment happening at the moment, the parents will be worrying that if they send their children to Australia, there might be racism happening to their children. And also, there's in the news that a couple of Asian people get attacked during the COVID-19 time. So this is not a very good message for the Chinese parents.
Yeah, that's true. So Doris, as you mentioned, there's opportunities that have emerged out of this. How Communications actually work with clients here in Australia. What's the best way to look at the Chinese market and put your mind in the place of a Chinese consumer?
Depends on the client's needs, and it depends on where the client is. So we are working with beauty clients, quite big beauty clients in Australia, and they have established the brand in China already. So with them, it's more about creating some campaigns, online campaigns, offline campaigns, to promote the brand name and get people to try their products. We are also working with a relatively new Australian food products.
Okay.
So for that, they are actually selling pretty well in Australia and also Europe.
Right.
But China is a totally new market to them. So for them, basically, we start from the research and we get people to test their products. And some of their products they're actually very proud of. It's not the flavor that the Chinese people will like.
Yeah.
And then we'll do the strategy and how to sell those products and then look for the distribution channels for them.
What about things like influencers? You know, in China, if you're paying influencers to promote and spruik your product, is that something that you recommend as well?
Yeah, influencers is a huge thing at the moment, and the live streaming, and it's actually getting bigger and bigger during the COVID-19 time
because everyone's at home.
People have nothing to do.
Yeah. I think that's a really important lesson that most Australian companies are very quickly having to learn, because if you want to have any success in China, you need to navigate that very different social media landscape, and the way that the consumers, especially the young emerging consumers who are going to spend on the products, they do everything on their WeChat, they do everything on their phone. They're not really looking at a website anymore, and they can't Google, as you say.
Yeah, well, we have Baidu in China, which is our equivalent of Google. Yeah, and the people also search products information on social media as well.
Okay. Now, while I've got you here, Doris, what's the thing around e-commerce? In China, that's been growing rapidly anyway, and labour cost is quite low there, so you've got a lot of local delivery options, a lot of local fulfilment. Do you see that, especially again because of the lockdown, that even companies in China have actually had a major increase with e-commerce?
Yeah, of course. E-commerce started, if I don't remember, around 2005 in China, and pretty quickly. So people are all on Alibaba's platform called Tmall and Taobao. One thing about that is the delivery in China is super quick.
Yeah.
You can do on the day delivery or the second day delivery. So that's how the e-commerce actually works for the Chinese audience. And especially during the COVID-19 period, people are ordering online.
Yeah.
And also through the live streaming, you need to order the stuff online. So the live streaming actually promote the e-commerce as well.
Wow.
So lots of people, even they didn't have the habit before during the COVID-19 period, they get into the habit, and this probably will be the habit in the future.
Yeah.
So this is definitely a huge thing in China. And for some Australian brands, e-commerce is probably the enter point to go into China.
Yeah.
And also for some products, say the beauty products, if you don't do animal tests, you won't be able to go through the general trade into China. You have to go through the e-commerce.
Right, yeah, so there's those regulatory requirements as well. One of the things I want to ask you, Doris, is how different are each of the provinces in China? So if you look at Shanghai versus Beijing, when I'm looking into selling to China, that's one big market, but there's obviously different consumer sentiment and different consumer preferences in each of those regions as well. Is that something you do with Hao Communications?
Yeah, at the moment, majority of our clients, we help them to go to the first and second tier market. That's where people buy the foreign products at the moment. However, from a study I just saw, third tier and the fourth tier, there is a potential in there. So I always tell people within Europe, so within that big size, there's so many countries.
That's right.
But China is so big, and within China there's so many provinces, and each province have their own dialects and their own habits. So it's totally different.
Yeah, there's a really strong opportunity for companies who are wanting to look at exporting or export growth, is to really reach out. While China has got this new appetite for e-commerce, new ways of distribution, and they can really work with you to do that as well.
Yeah.
Just before we wrap up, Doris, what are the sort of tips and advice you'd give to Australian exporters? And even from an importer's point of view, how do you see these tensions playing out? What do you see evolving in the next 3, 6 to 12 months between Australia and China from a consumer perspective?
I think you need to be aware of what's happening. So the situation at the moment, it's not serious yet among the Chinese consumers. However, if there are more restrictions, especially restriction on e-commerce channels, which means that Australian products will have a higher tax, harder to get into the China market, and you have to raise your price, and it probably take you a while to go through the customer clearance.
Right.
So the consumers probably will turn into other products. So you will lose the market. So this is one thing. Another thing I want to say, if you are looking at the China market, make sure that at least you have a Chinese in your team who know the market. Even for me, I have been in Australia for over 10 years now, and sometimes I need to go back to my team in Beijing and ask what's happening there.
Yeah, things change so rapidly.
You won't be able to catch up.
Yeah, that's right. Great. Well, it's been an absolute delight to have you on the show, Doris. Thanks so much for sharing your insights and giving us a bit of an insight as to the sentiment from a Chinese consumer perspective. Really recommend all of you as viewers, if you're looking at the Chinese market, get in touch with Doris and the team at How Communications. They can really help you fast track your market entry or improve that sales channels into China. So thanks again, Doris.
Thank you for having me.
No worries, and we look forward to chatting with you, keeping in touch very soon.
Great.
Great.
This is Import Export with Lawrence Christoffelsz.